Okay, hello and welcome everyone. We can get started. My name is Anharid Lang. I'm the Executive Director of PHAP, that's short for the International Association of Professionals in Humanitarian Assistance and Protection. My great pleasure to be welcoming everyone to this online session, Operational Camp Management, an Introduction to the Camp Management Standards, organized by PHAP in partnership with the CCCM Cluster. For those of you who may be less familiar with us, PHAP is a global society of humanitarian practitioners and other stakeholders on the front lines of assistance and protection efforts worldwide. And as a part of its mission, PHAP as an association engages this broad community, and we have a great cross-section represented online today, as well as our in-house analytical capacity to help develop and also to help revise standards in the humanitarian sector, as well as contribute to other consultation efforts to bridge the gap between policy and practice. If you'd like to have more information about this stream of work of PHAP or to inquire about a potential collaboration, please do feel free to contact us at any time at consultations@phap.org. Now, getting to today's business, we are holding today the first online consultation event on the draft camp management standards, which we hope will be the first of several interactive events on this topic. This webinar and also the survey that preceded it is an opportunity for practitioners to learn more about the technical area of camp management and the draft camp management standards and their development, and also to provide their input on this initiative, which is active and ongoing as we speak. We'll be joined today by a set of experts on camp management from UNHCR, IOM, the Danish Refugee Council, and the CCCM Cluster for what I believe will be a very dynamic and interesting discussion. It's also been very encouraging to see the level of engagement on this topic. We've had hundreds of you completing the pre-event survey, which was not a short survey, I will note. There was a lot of work that had to go into responding to that. So thank you very much for the time and thought that you put into that. We had hundreds of you completing the survey. The deadline was yesterday, but we're going to be extending that just a bit. So if you haven't had a chance to complete the survey, you can still do that today. If you do it by the end of the day today, we'll be able to include your inputs in the final report. So I'm looking forward to learning something about the initial highlights. We'll hear that from my colleague Marcus Forsberg later in today's events. I'd also like to point out that the structure of our event today is a bit different from some of our other webinars, in that we have a lot of people who are participating in groups together around the world. So a warm welcome not only to everyone logged in on their individual computers, but also those of you who are in groups together. I hope you'll be able to nominate someone in each of those rooms to be able to submit any questions that come up in those groups. Okay, so for our agenda today, we're going to be covering quite a lot of ground. First, to get us started, we have brief recorded messages from the Director General of IOM, Antonio Victorino, as well as from the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, Filippo Grandi, on the critical importance of camp management, as well as the Camp Management Standards Initiative. I'll then be asking our panelists to introduce the area of camp management, to help us understand what challenges these standards are trying to address. And then after this, we'll be hearing about how the standards came about, as well as the drafting process, and also a bit of how practitioners have reacted so far to this initiative in the face-to-face consultations that have been carried out to date. That's in particular the consultations in Cox's Bazar and also in South Sudan. We'll then turn to some highlights that we have already from the pre-event survey that many of you filled in, and we'll discuss those results. There were also quite a few questions submitted by participants before the event related to the content of the standards, the structure, implementation, some other issues. We're going to discuss a number of these questions as well, as many as we can, and I'm sure that there will also be new questions arising in real time during the events. To the extent that we don't have time to cover any of those questions, the panelists have kindly committed to answering questions in writing after the event as well. So even if you see we're running short on time, if you've got a great question in mind, please do submit it through the Ask a Question box, and we'll address that in writing and send that as a compilation to everyone after the event, together with the event recording. Now, before getting started with the agenda, I'd like to introduce our guest panelists. So today we're joined by 4 speakers, all of whom are experienced practitioners in camp management. And we're going to unmute everyone now, so you can say a brief hello as I go down through the list. So first of all, Gebre Unatu has worked in emergency response and humanitarian operations for 15 years, first with the Ethiopian government, managing reception sites and camps and responses to protection concerns. Having worked with the Danish Refugee Council since 2012 in various roles and countries, he is currently a member of the DRC Emergency Team, MPACT, as a global emergency specialist for the technical sectors of CCCM, protection, and emergency response. Welcome, Gebre. Great to have you on the line.
Hello, Anand, and thank you for having me.
Our pleasure. And we're also pleased to welcome Jennifer Kvernmo, who has been the Global Camp Coordination and Camp Management CCCM Capacity Building Coordinator and Rapid Response Officer for IOM since 2013. She worked previously as a practitioner and consultant in the fields of humanitarian assistance and post-conflict programming. Her experience as a camp manager in Sierra Leone initiated the Camp Management Toolkit, widely recognized as a comprehensive reference tool providing guidelines and best practice for camp managers. It's a resource which we will also be discussing today, in particular how it relates to the new draft standards. Welcome, Jennifer. Great to have you.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having us.
Then next, Catherine Ziga is currently CCCM Cluster Coordinator in Somalia. She happens to be here in Geneva at the moment, so we've got her in the office with us as well. She's been working in CCCM since 2012 in South Sudan and Somalia operations as a camp manager and in cluster coordination, having focused in particular on community participation and engagement, site planning and improvement, and mobile approaches to CCCM. Welcome,
everyone.
Catherine. And then I'm not sure that we've managed yet to connect to Sabbat. No. Okay, so we're going to try again in a few minutes. We're planning to have with us on the line as well Sabbat Juma, who has worked with UNHCR as a CCCM field associate in South Sudan since 2013. He previously worked with UN Habitat, focusing on land disputes. And again, we don't yet have Sabbat back on the line, but he was disconnected, but we'll be trying to get him back during the event, so hopefully he'll be able to come in soon. Okay, so then to get us started, let's first hear the statement from Antonio Victorino, Director General of IOM, which he recorded specifically for today's webinar.
Natural disasters and conflict have forced unprecedented numbers of people to seek temporary assistance and protection across the world. Millions are uprooted from their homes, seek safety in camps or camp-like settings. As the CCCM Cluster co-lead with UNHCR, the International Organization for Migration works alongside 500 partners around the world to provide dignified and timely services to displaced populations in camps. I'm proud that the CCCM Cluster has drafted camp management standards that draw on the wealth of experience they have consulting with affected communities, humanitarian actors, and governments. These standards will guide the future of humanitarian intervention in camps and ensure that humanitarian actors uphold the rights and dignity of displaced people. They set out best practices for establishing governance structures, coordinating services and assistance across sectors, and minimizing and mitigating protection risks. This webinar is the first step in a comprehensive consultation process with humanitarian practitioners. Camps must remain a last resort in sudden onset and man-made emergencies. But when they are necessary, it is our responsibility to make sure communities can access life-saving services and live in safety. We rely on your expertise and diverse experiences to enhance and improve these CCCM standards, and wish you continued success in the critical operational work you do.
And thank you. And colleagues at UNHCR have also given us permission to use these remarks from Filippo Grandi, UN High Commissioner for Refugees, which he recorded for a recent meeting on camp management.
Good camp coordination and camp management play a critical role in ensuring the protection and well-being of people who have been uprooted from their homes and communities. Through your direct presence in displaced communities living in camps, transit sites, informal settlements, and other collective locations, including in the world's most unstable and insecure areas, you have a unique understanding of the perspectives, aspirations, and circumstances of people affected by disaster and conflict. You play a key role in providing them with a safe environment, and in helping them start to rebuild their lives and connect with the societies, communities, and opportunities around them. You are also in a position to act as effective and informed advocates for their protection and well-being, and to ensure that their voices, perspectives, and priorities are actively heard and acted on, not just by aid agencies, but by all those whose decisions have an impact on their lives. I encourage you to continually explore new and innovative ways of amplifying their voices and enhancing your dialogue with them so that we are genuinely accountable to them in all that we do.
Okay, great. Thank you. Great to have those opening remarks to get us launched for this discussion. Now, I'd like to turn to Catherine, first of all, to ask a few questions about camp management as a technical sector and the role of camp managers and camp management agencies. So, Catherine, what would you say is the overall goal of camp management as a technical sector?
Sure. The goal of camp management is to improve the living conditions and protection of displaced people and ensure that they have equal access to services provided in a camp. So camp management agencies are responsible for the overall running of a camp. This includes providing coordination among stakeholders, monitoring basic service provision to ensure that minimum standards are met and that everyone can access the services, and working with camp governance structures such as camp committees or women's committees to ensure that participation of all the population is included. Camp management actors also ensure that living conditions in camps are dignified and safe, and that the camp design and services meet the needs of the population. We also work with local authorities and displaced people to build their capacity to manage future displacements and to work towards durable solutions for the people that are displaced.
Okay, perfect. Thanks. We've also received a number of questions from participants, for example, Saidu in Nigeria, Gilbert in DRC, and others who would like to know more about the roles and responsibilities of those working in camp management, as of course this relates to standards for those practices. Could you perhaps provide an overview of the different job roles that work in camp management?
Sure. So camp management requires an entire team. It's not just the camp manager. Camp managers oversee the running of a camp, but it takes a lot of different people to do this. A camp management team is made up of different people, such as camp officers who are in the sites every single day. There's information managers who support the data management and information being collected in the camp. Sometimes there are registration clerks and database officers to keep records of the populations. There are site planners and engineers who look after the infrastructure. There are community mobilizers who work with the camp governance structures. There are outreach workers who support complaint and feedback or running sensitization campaigns. And usually the majority of people working in a camp are actually residents of this camp or members of the nearby host community.
Okay, very helpful. Thank you. I'd like to turn now to Gebre, as you're coming at this from a bit of a different angle, working for an international NGO. Gebre, do you have something to add on this question about different roles in camp management? Over to you.
Thank you, Anand. Yes. Well, one thing I would like to say is that though the cluster system has some of its own requirements for the roles in a camp, and you'll have many agencies will have different requirements placed on them by their donors or by government actors. It's always important to remember that your structure should reflect the needs on the ground and the strategy that you set for yourself. There have been operations where we've had totally different structures, job descriptions, and roles in two camps of the same operation, simply because it was determined that it's easier, or it maximizes our resources to achieve our aims. And I think NGOs especially should be aware that setting their own strategy, setting their own operational objectives and aims is critical, and they should design their functions based on that.
Okay, excellent. Thanks a lot. Now, along oh, sorry, did I interrupt? Go ahead, Gebre. You had something else to add.
No, I was closing, so that I was...
No, okay. Okay. Okay, very good. So along the same lines of outlining what is camp management, who's involved, I'll go back to you, Catherine, to ask, what are the primary agencies directly involved in camp management?
So camp management is primarily the role of the government, and so depending on which country you're in, the camp management is provided by the specific government responsible for displaced people in that country. However, in cases that this role cannot be taken on by local authorities, international and national NGOs or UN agencies might step in to provide the services. So at global level, IOM and UNHCR co-lead the CCM cluster, and then international and national NGOs are usually the ones providing camp management services. We have over 500 partners in the cluster, and for example, in the country I'm working in, some of the international organizations providing camp management are ACTED, Danish Refugee Council, Norwegian Refugee Council, but the majority of the services are provided by national NGOs who are working in the different communities in Somalia.
Okay, and then the role of the CCCM cluster itself in relation to the agencies?
Sure. So the CCM cluster provides the overall coordination of the CCCM interventions at national level in a response. This includes developing the strategy for how you're going to do camp management in a country, ensuring standards are met across partners and in different areas and in sites, representing CCM partners in the inter-cluster working group with the other clusters that are activated in the country, and at subnational level, providing country-level data for the other clusters, and advocating for funding for the partners to be able to implement these projects.
Okay, great. And then getting to the fact that there are a variety of different contexts we're looking at here, given that many displaced people are not in, so to speak, traditional camps, in quotes, but rather dispersed in urban contexts or living in informal camps or similar. What is the role of camp management in these situations? Does this lead to overlaps, perhaps, with other areas?
So doing camp management in an out-of-camp or dispersed camp setting, we apply the same principles as the traditional camp management atmosphere, but you just have to adapt to the context. So we still provide information on services being delivered in sites, and we still coordinate the response at site level. It just might be for dozens of camps, dozens of small camps rather than one formal camp. We still work with camp committees, and we still support the participation of population, but it might be using a mobile team or with information centers that serve several camps instead of just one. It can definitely lead to overlap with partners because in most situations we're adapting to a different context, so it hasn't been done before. So it's important that we establish clear roles and responsibilities at the beginning with all actors, just to ensure that all the gaps are being covered and that people aren't stepping on each other's toes too much. But it's a lot of dialogue, but it's not impossible by any means.
Excellent, thank you. And turning once again to Gebre, do you have anything to add on this question of different contexts?
2 points I would like to make. The first is that when we're talking about different contexts, there's a tendency sometimes to include urban contexts for cities or villages already existing, or human settlements that are already existing when there's a displacement into them, for NGOs or the humanitarian world in general to consider them as part of something where we would establish camp management. Usually that should be taken under very strict, much stricter rules I don't think it's just an expansion of our existing roles, because there are already existing municipal and administrative bodies there, or they should be, that should be able to provide the services that camp managers would otherwise provide. For example, if you're talking about monitoring services, whether it's the service for water or providing addressing or things like this, existing municipal and government authorities should have taken that role on where they exist. So it's not simply a matter of planning. You're replacing. It's not simply a matter of expanding your existing structure or responsibility. We would be replacing an existing authority, and we would be doing it perhaps to the detriment of the overall operation at times. So it is a much more serious decision, I think, and it shouldn't be conflated with simple camp management in that sense. That's one point. The second point is that we should always assess the impact we will have when we do that. When we're taking on a camp that's being established anew, or a new camp is being established by the authorities and we're supporting that, it's one thing to go in there and establish new systems. In those cases where a government or an administration is withdrawing from that responsibility, we should always consider whether it's worth advocating for them to take on that responsibility, or even challenging humanitarian or government decisions that humanitarian actors take on that responsibility. So that is a much more difficult, I think, extension or responsibility than just going in to manage a new camp in a displacement or an emergency. Okay, that was all I wanted to add.
Okay, great, thank you. Let's see, we have a question that's come in. Let me just... So I think I'll take a moment here actually to ask this question to you, Gebre, and then perhaps to Catherine, as I think it's pertinent to this kind of first discussion about defining camp management. So Regina has asked, how long does it normally take for a CCCM to become fully operational post-emergency? Perhaps you could give us a bit of context there about how things work in your experience in terms of the timing. First, Gebre.
In terms of the timing, I think I'll let Catherine say more about the coordination aspect. As for a camp management team, depending on the agency, of course, it will take us everywhere from 2 days to a week, depending on prevailing conditions, government acceptance, and our financial situation, of course. But that doesn't mean that once you establish it, it's done. Even in emergency, the first 3-4 months, camp management will be taking on more roles or changing its structure depending on the day-to-day needs. Every time you get an influx, every time you get a new population, there will be a new dynamic. Depending on the country you're in or the location, there will be various factors that will force you to change. So it is an ongoing process. And the establishment side, of course, there are standards to what we say when we're established. We have X amount of people doing Y amount of jobs, but it's an ongoing process at the beginning of an emergency, at least. That's my response to that.
Perfect, thanks a lot. And over to you, Catherine, for the coordination perspective.
Sure. So I agree with Gebre for sure that for camp management, within the first week of a displacement or when you have access to a population, camp management can become effective. For cluster coordination or camp coordination, it takes a bit longer. For example, in Somalia, the cluster was activated in 2017 to respond to the drought. And I would say it took about a month probably for us to operationalize the cluster, doing like the information gathering on what the response should look like, meeting with the government to understand which roles the the agencies would take and what the government would do. And then a lot of it is really based on training of partners. Since camp management was new to Somalia as a sector, but people had been working in camps for years, so they had the basis down. But we really had to work on training of the government and the partners to understand how like CCCM would look in the country. So I would say it took at least 1 month, but probably up to 6 for us to have an impact in the inter-cluster working groups and with all of the response plans and everything, and to get partners. At this point, it's been 2 years, and I think are up to 15 partners, but it's been a process for sure.
Terrific. Thank you so much. So now, having heard these initial perspectives on camp management as an area of work and how it's conceptualized, how it works in practice, it's time to turn to the initiative to create camp management standards. So for this, I'd like to turn to Jennifer. You have been involved in this since the very beginning. So I'd like to start with the question, where did the idea come from for the camp management standards and why are they needed? Over to you, Jennifer.
Thank you. So the idea for camp management standards has been in existence for a while, I would say over 10 years. When I joined the support team in 2013, there was already the idea that we could develop a sphere companion and that it would be a fairly straightforward process to kind of just write out the camp management standards, and then we could share them and they would be widely agreed. And as it happened, there were maybe we were a little bit naive in how that would actually transpire, because the all kinds of different political agency views started coming in and saying, like, no, this is really important that we have this, and it's really important that we have this. And the process stopped. And so it was really strange because everyone was agreeing that it was important for us to have standards, and yet there wasn't a whole lot of vision about what those standards would actually provide once they were there and once they were drafted. So it's taken us a while to refocus that, and I would say from 2017 there's been a lot more agreement about why they're needed. And they're needed really because we need benchmarks. We need to be able to work a little bit faster. Gebre and Catherine have just talked a lot about how hard it is to get a cluster up and running, or to find partners to work with, or to get government agreements. But if we had set benchmarks that could measure performance, or that could provide a really structured way to do capacity building, or to build a response during a sudden onset emergency, or to guide and harmonize practice between different camps, and to say this is the basic minimum level that we would want to see in every single location, then it would be a lot easier for us to be able to respond more quickly. So there's a lot of reasons why they're needed, but I think we're a lot closer to understanding and to getting agreement on what they can be.
Great, thank you. So before we move on, I'm going to pause for another question that's just come in. I'm afraid this one's a bit of a provocative one, but it seems the perfect time to raise it. So I'll throw this one over to you, Jennifer. So this is coming in from Zachary, who says that at a recent Sphere Standards event that he attended, the question had come up about camp management standards, and it was said that CCCM is not included in the most recent update to the Sphere Standards because, quote, the science of CCCM has not evolved. What is your perspective on this?
I'm laughing a little bit because, yeah, it is a provocative question. So I think that the management of camps has evolved a lot, and I think that I would really love to talk to Zachary more in person, because maybe he hasn't seen how the science of camp management has been evolving as a technical sector. I think humanitarian work in general has changed a lot as a technical sector. So the question was, why are there no camp management standards? In the very beginning, when we started the Camp Management Toolkit, we had the ability to be able to say that in every particular context, we would need to rely on the local standards. And I think that that's true, actually, today in relationship to what we're discussing is in regards to standards in general and the role of governments. But if we're looking at the local standards and we're setting minimum benchmarks, then those minimum benchmarks should be measurable in technical standards, even in camp management. And if we're talking about social standards as opposed to, which is what camp management would be doing as opposed to a technical standard, then I think we could be able to say that representation would be a minimum standard that camp management would want to provide in any camp in the world.
Great, thank you for that. So getting back to this process, which is underway, when did you start the process, and what's the overall timeline for getting to a getting to a final version?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question? I couldn't hear you.
Oh, sorry. When did you? My apologies, I had a problem with my mute button. So the question was, when did you start the process, the current process, and what's the overall timeline for getting to a final version?
The goal was actually to do it within this year. And so we have the work plan was to do in-person consultations and then online consultations, and we were able to actually consult in person with almost 200 people this year, and I think that that's a phenomenal effort because it really was taken on the side of all the work that all the other clusters have done and all the other operations have done. I see a lot of people from Bangladesh have joined the call, and actually one of the consultations was in Bangladesh. So there's been this concerted effort to finish up the standards this year. However, we haven't been able to finish them because we haven't gotten dedicated funding. So as far as finishing up it, we hope to be able to be done within 2020. The objective would be to not only finish our own camp management minimum standards, but then to harmonize those and translate them into other languages and put them into our capacity building materials as well.
Okay, great. So you mentioned that there have been face-to-face consultations with camp management practitioners in different locations. You mentioned some took place in Bangladesh. What were the other locations?
Sure. So we had one in Somalia. Actually, Catherine did one with her partners. I think there were 11 partners that she consulted with there. There was a really long consultation that took place in South Sudan, and most recently we had one in Iraq.
Okay, great, thank you. So we will hear just very shortly about these consultations in a bit more detail, but in general, how have these results been fed into the drafting process?
They've fed into the results in a couple ways. So one, they've reinforced the need for camp management standards, and I think that can't be underscored enough, because when there is the agreement among us as practitioners and saying, yes, we do need minimum standards and we do need to be able to refer back to something, that has been largely recognized and reinforced through the in-person consultations. And the other kind of result has been around seeking more precision from other people that have been involved in the consultations. So if, for a really practical example, so in the Iraq consultations, there seemed to be some confusion about data protection, for example. And it seems that the people that were involved in the consultation didn't really understand the role of what the camp management data protection would be. So they didn't realize, perhaps, that the camp manager would have access to the names and addresses of where people would come from. And so, yes, camp management would still need to be responsible for data protection. So the in-person consultations have showed us where we need to have more precision, for example. They've showed us where we need to specify a lot more about the roles and responsibilities of the camp management agency and how they don't overlap with other sectors.
Great, thank you. Am I correct in that you've also been involving affected people in the camps directly in the consultation stage?
Yes, absolutely correct. And that was a decision that I'm really proud of, because we have a working group. It's not just one particular agency that's working on this. We have a kind of working group task force that's been dedicated to providing guidance to each other in the camp management standards revision process. And so when we decided to start doing in-person consultations, that was one of the questions that we asked the working group, and it was, should we be consulting directly with the affected population? And overwhelmingly, everyone in the working group said yes, because if we're working directly with people in one of the most traumatic points of their life, that we need to make sure that we're actually consulting them about what is it that we as camp management should be representing them on. And that's really what we do in camp settings. And so when we're setting our benchmarks and our standards, that we felt that that was an important step to take as well.
Very good, thank you. So we're going to take a brief pause here to try again to bring in Sabbat on the line. Everyone will excuse us for just a moment. Okay, Sabbat, are you able to hear me?
Yes, I'm hearing you now.
Ah, excellent.
Hello?
Great that you're able to join again. That's terrific to have you with us. So we introduced you at the beginning, but once again, now that you're actually here, Sabbat Juma, CCCM Field Associate with UNHCR. So we've just gotten to the point, Sabbat, where we'd like to discuss a bit in more detail about some of the face-to-face consultations that were carried out. And as you were a part of carrying out the consultations in Juba in South Sudan, I'd like to ask you a bit about that experience and some of the key points that came out of those consultations. So first of all, who were you trying to reach with these consultations in Juba?
Thank you very much. In Juba, we were trying to reach out to IDPs in POC, that is the protection of civilians, in complex settings. We were trying to reach out to our partners, national and international NGOs. We were trying to reach out to the host community.
And are there any particular results that you would highlight from the consultations? In particular, was there anything that you found surprising that came as part of the results?
Not really surprising, but there were many points which came out from the different groups, partners and IDPs, which was reflecting the reality on the ground, especially when we take the situation in the POC. The issue of space was one of the major issues because in the protection of civilians or the POC, it is really congested, and then it was very difficult to, let us say, to apply any kind of a standard because it is a challenge. And in fact, that one came out clearly, and then showing the difficulties the IDPs are really facing in the POCs, and even the collective centers, the same thing.
All right, thank you. I'd like to turn over to Gebre, as I know you were also involved in the consultations, to ask the same question regarding the highlights, the results of the consultations. Was there anything on your side that you found surprising? Over to you, Gebre.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Gebre.
Okay. Surprising, yes. As Sabit said about the POCs, we got a lot of responses, strong responses from the populations there. But one of the things that came out very strongly, I think, was that where we had two camps which were managed by church organizations. And because they had their own separate structure of authorities, and they were not part of the humanitarian coordination, we were at first quite worried about how to present humanitarian coordination to them. But once we got there, what surprised us was the commonalities that we shared in terms of what they felt needed to be done for camp management. what basic standards we should agree on. Of course, given that they have a different structure and their own authorities within the legal context in South Sudan, and that they are very separate from the humanitarian world, they also have their own different practices. But what surprised a lot of us was the basics that we agreed on in terms of objectives for camp management and some of the basic necessities that we could agree for. Now, that's all I would like to add.
Right, thank you. A follow-up question, first to you, Gebre, then also to Sabit. So you mentioned the coming together of different perspectives. An interesting example of the church organizations involved in the management of a couple of the camps. Were there other differences in views that you found? So, for example, between staff of NGOs versus those working for UN agencies, or views perhaps of people, affected people in the camps. Did you see any other interesting differences in views of people working in different kinds of organizations or from different perspectives? First to Gebre.
Yes, there were NGOs, given that, as Sabit mentioned, that most of the camp settings there were protection of civilians, with the Department of Peacekeeping Operations taking over the administrative role. There were a few camps that were not managed that way, but for the majority that was the case. And there were very different opinions about the overall humanitarian objectives we should meet. I would say more between the DPKO and the rest of the humanitarian world rather than between humanitarian agencies. Of course, there were differences in opinion in terms of what we should do for a particular camp or what policy we should implement between, let's say, IOM and DRC, or UNHCR and DRC, and of course, that's quite normal and common. But there was an overall, I think, mismatch of objectives in terms of what we are doing there between DPKO and the rest of the humanitarian community. And I think that played out quite a lot in our conversations there, and it did affect, of course, how the population in these POCs responded. Having said that, our primary goal during the consultations was to take up the humanitarian standards, so we didn't focus too much on the DPKO side of the opinion, I have to say. Or we didn't reflect the DPKO's opinion too much.
Got it. Thank you. So back to you, Sabit. What do you recall in terms of different views on the standards, in particular between staff of NGOs versus people working for UN agencies, or other differences you may have encountered in the consultations? Over to you, Sabit.
Yeah. In fact, as Gabriel mentioned, in fact, for example, if you take the issue of the POC, you find that it is not the government who is in charge as an administrator, but it's a unit. And then NGOs are working there, and then camp management is also one of the NGOs who is working inside. So when it comes to issues of security, for example, it is the units, and then, in fact, the roles and responsibilities there sometimes it's challenging, and then some are having this different opinion that now how we can work, but otherwise they are working together, the units, RRP, and then the NGOs. But yes, that was one of the different differences which was shown there. And again, in the collective centers, also we have seen, like in one of the collective centers as mentioned by Gabriel, which is managed by the church, and then it is the preachers managing it, and then when it comes to a security situation there, it is a bit difficult because he cannot really manage the security. Even sometimes you try to ask the government to support, but the government cannot, and then it goes to units. Sometimes units come to patrol in order to solve the situation. And then when you see another camp, it is people who came out from the POC, which is called Mangaten, IDPs were asking there that now why people are protected in units by the units, but for them they are not protected and they are just left like that. They should bring units there. So I think these are the different opinions which was around that issue of role and responsibility regarding the security and also the roles in the POC and then the collective center.
All right, thank you. So now before we get back to talking a bit more about the content of the standards, I would like to go back to Jennifer, as she was involved in the consultations in Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh. Now, having heard the points that Sabit and Gebre have raised from the Juba consultations, did you see any similarities in the consultations in Bangladesh?
I think the issues
Over
in
to you,
Cox's
Jennifer.
Bazar were really different than the issues that they were facing in South Sudan. But one of the main differences that we saw was that the NGOs were much more focused on the precision of the details of the document. So, for example, there was quite a lot of feedback around the last section, which was around, or the fifth standard around exit strategies and camp closure. And so they were very helpful, those consultations, in refocusing what were the main camp responsibilities at operational level. But I think when we talked to the camp communities, I was so touched by both of the consultations with the affected population about how thankful they were to the humanitarian agencies, how much trust and responsibility and objectivity that they felt that the ASMS agencies held. And I felt like that was really, really a great feedback. And they also gave us really details about the importance of consulting different people. So, for example, in the consultation with men, the focus group discussion there, they talked a lot about, in the representation section, actually who would be the right people to be involved in the representation of their population. So, for example, they pointed out the special and particular role that widowed women held. And, for example, they also were able to put a prioritization on services for common services. So whereas a humanitarian view would come in and say, oh, let's build a child-friendly space here, they prioritized their religious practice as the most important common space that should be within a facility. And I felt that that was really useful information back to the humanitarian population there, and that level of detail and that contribution from the consultations would allow us to have a lot more precision and a lot more differentiation, kind of, if you think about it, from the advice back to the camp management agency who would be doing that job.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. Now, in reviewing the questions that we received just before this webinar, and indeed during the webinar now, we have a lot of questions coming from colleagues who are based in Bangladesh. You noted yourself at the beginning, we have a lot of colleagues from Bangladesh on the line right now, and a lot have questions, many of which are centered around this issue of the relationship between humanitarian organizations and the government. So the theme here is looking at settings where, as Moses says, the national government has put in place restrictions that may run counter to the objectives of your agency, asking how would the standards approach this problem? Another colleague saying that as humanitarian workers, we're taught that we need to negotiate with government stakeholders. Do the standards provide any guidance on this? Should the standards provide any guidance on this? Another example from Kiamong, what is the best practice when government actors are responsible for going against primary protection concerns. He raises examples of data protection, corruption, even assaults on beneficiaries. Are the standards going to deal with this area? A challenging series of questions, but given the context that we're talking about, could I go back to you with that, Jennifer, and see what are your reflections on those questions? I'm sure they must have come up as well in the context of the face-to-face consultations.
There were a lot of questions there, so maybe we could take one. And I think the interesting part about governments, we have many governments that are working at national level as camp managers themselves. And I think that provides a real opportunity to build understanding about what are humanitarian principles. And if government is working in the role at site level, then what are the best practices? And what would be the way to best uphold those standards in any particular displacement setting? So the consultations that we've done and that I've been involved in, and the standards themselves don't make reference specifically to the humanitarian standards, although our training materials do in many contexts. And I've seen actually a great number of government officials embrace them and find them useful.
Very good, thank you. I'd like to go with the same sort of set of questions about potential challenges and the relationship between humanitarian actors and government counterparts. Go over to Gebre. Do you have some reflections on this that you could share?
Yes. To add on to what Jennifer just said, I was in Bangladesh as well during the last 2 years. And I have been a government worker for a long time. So just from that perspective, I would like to say to our colleagues that given that if the CCM cluster is already established and they have already accepted at some primary level the humanitarian standards or the international legal standards that we are trying to implement or support in the implementation, as Jennifer said, they would have already formally accepted somehow most of what we've said. Most of what we're trying to do. So in that light, at the local level, yes, there will be a lot of challenges, but every NGO or INGO needs to strategize how to overcome those challenges. Sometimes it's day to day, sometimes it's by going at higher levels or through coordination. I don't know if Catherine and others or Jennifer has something to say on that, but having a pre-established set of standards that have already agreed before we enter an operation, so governments know what we're about to do or what we're trying to do, and they give their formal acceptance of this, goes a long way to helping us establish that access and establish a standard of working even with the government. Of course, day to day, things will change, and day to day there are other difficulties, especially in Bangladesh, which is a very complicated government setup. But in my view, the humanitarian standards will help us at least have some formal document already pre-agreed that we can say, well, this is what we were supposed to be doing. This is what we're supposed to achieve in terms of activities. So here you go. And I think I'm hoping that will help us along the line instead of currently trying to negotiate everything.
Excellent, thank you. Thank you. That's very helpful. So we're going to move now to the section of the webinar where we're going to be looking briefly through some of the highlighted results from the survey that I think all of you who are online now probably responded to, as well as many hundreds of others who weren't able to join the webinar today. I'd like to turn over to my colleague Marcus Forsberg, who's been coordinating this process. And Marcus, you can walk us through some of the highlights that you've already managed to glean from the responses.
So this survey that we
just concluded the first stage of yesterday was designed as a first opportunity for practitioners to provide their input on this drafting process. And as such, the primary focus was on the overall scope and purpose of the standards in order to make sure that there is sufficient agreement on some of the fundamental questions before moving further with the drafting process and going into more detailed input. But second, the survey also gathered more in-depth comments on the content and text of the 5 standards from those who were willing to engage at this level already now. And these results will also be directly feeding into the next draft of the standard. As the initial survey deadline was yesterday, I will be providing just some highlights from the first section of the survey on the overall scope and purpose, which can help inform our discussion today. Then a more comprehensive report will be presented to the CCCM cluster and circulated to the survey participants at a somewhat later date once we're done with the analysis. But as Anherd said before as well, for anyone who wants a last chance to submit their survey responses, they can do so before the end of today, anytime before tomorrow. So first, a look at the respondents. So I was very impressed by the engagement in this survey. A lot of practitioners really went out of their way to provide in-depth comments on this standard. So a few words about who has completed it. So we had 398 respondents based in 68 countries. There was a quite even mix of those having an international scope of work and those working primarily at the national level. NGO respondents were particularly well represented, but with a large number also from the UN and other intergovernmental agencies. Then government, Red Cross and Red Crescent movement, academia, private sector, and others made up the remaining 15% of the respondents. And then finally, also, although this consultations focus really is on the view of humanitarian practitioners, it is important to note that many working in this sector have also been affected by the same types of crises that they are now responding to. So 21% of the respondents reported that they had been displaced themselves in the past. So they also brought that perspective to their responses. So looking at the first substantive question, this was on the purpose of the standards. So asked to rank how they would prioritize the potential purposes of camp management, of the camp management standards, the results were quite stark. 3 purposes that I at least would consider to be in the area of providing guidance came out well ahead of the others. So preparedness and planning, operational guidance, and standard operating procedures. While on the other hand, the purposes which are more in the area of accountability, standardization, and comparability between contexts, those purposes of standards trail behind considerably. Also on the overall purpose, when asked about whether they saw the need for an aspirational standard that defines an ideal state that needs to be worked towards in all contexts through just continuous improvement. So not necessarily something that can easily be reached or can be reached at all perhaps, or on the other hand whether there should be a minimum standard that defines the essentials that should be achievable in all contexts. A quite strong majority favored the minimum standard model, but many also prefer the aspirational standard model. I'll pause there and hand over to you, Anherd.
Great, thanks a lot, Marcus. So yes, a good opportunity, I think, to throw a question over to Jennifer. So reflecting on the results that we have so far, and I know these are very fresh, what are your thoughts regarding the primary purpose of the standards? So are you surprised or not surprised to see, as Marcus pointed out, the primary purpose in the eyes of the survey responders being more around preparedness, planning, operational guidance, and much less related to accountability. What are your thoughts? Over to you, Jennifer.
Well, very fresh is exactly the word, because I was looking at them live as Marcus was putting them up there, and I've been super excited to see them and all the different contributions. So I am so inspired by the fact that people think that they're minimum standards as opposed to aspirational standards, because that means that we can use them in every single location, and that it isn't something that we should have to compromise on to save representation, or that the camp management role is to provide that representation role and to set up governance. That makes me really, really, really happy, actually, because no one's saying that it isn't the core camp management responsibility. So that's great. And could you go back to the slide that showed the feedback? No, the one before that. That was really great. About using it in preparedness and planning. If only we could use it more in preparedness and planning. That would mean that there were actually governments that had representatives that were ready to manage sites if there was displacement. I mean, let's remember actually that sudden onset disasters happen 3 times more than conflicts. Let's remember actually that we don't have a way to capture and respond to all kinds of slow onset disasters right now. And when we look at IDMC figures and what are the most likely scenarios, or how long are displacements lasting? So, displacements lasting sometimes up to 17 years or longer for internally displaced people. So if we're able to actually use this in planning, that means that there are going to be people who are actually well prepared and well understanding of what the job is going to be, and that we're going to have less kind of emergency response, and that governments are going to be more prepared, and that NGOs are going to know more what to do in an emergency if it should strike. So I think these are phenomenal purposes of standards and applications of standards to be minimum in all sites. I'm very happy.
Perfect, thanks. Quickly, I'd like to jump over to Gebre. I know oh, sorry. No, never mind. We're going to move on to the next issue. Marcus, over to you. We're going to keep moving because the clock is ticking.
Looking at the next area, when asked who should be responsible for ensuring that the standards are followed, the largest category was at 37% actually camp management agencies themselves. Then also, I guess somewhat related, about a quarter of respondents wanted to put that responsibility on the Global CCCM Cluster. But also, interestingly, although they are in the minority in this set of respondents, more than a third wanted to put that responsibility of ensuring that they're implemented on bodies external, so to speak, to camp management agencies, government authorities, donor agencies, and then close to 20% wanting an actual independent monitoring body for standards of this type. Yes.
Yes, so on this, I'm going to turn to Gebre. As you do have, you have a wide variety of experience in different roles, including working with the government as well. What are your views on this question of external accountability? Is it your impression that agencies and the CCCM cluster can provide sufficient implementation and accountability themselves for these standards? To what degree is there a need for external accountability? What are your thoughts?
I think there is quite a large need for external accountability, not just for CCM, but for the entire humanitarian sector, and for anyone who's providing services to people under some framework of laws and rules. Preferably in a professional setting or a profession. We should also try to create our own standards of accountability, which for me, this is why the camp management standards are so important, to allow us to at least hold each other to account for our professional behavior, our decisions, our policies for implementation, and to allow others also who are not practitioners, who are not professionals, who perhaps don't have the technical skills to challenge us on our day-to-day work, for them to at least to challenge us on the objectives we're trying to achieve. So having a public formal agreement on a standard would, in my view, help us to achieve that accountability, more principled humanitarian action.
Perfect. Thanks a lot, Gebre. And back to you, Marcus,
thank you.
for the next point.
So when asked about the actual content of the draft standards in their current form, respondents had been asked to first read this draft, and having done so, close to 3/4 of everyone agreed that the scope of the standards adequately covered the essentials of camp management, while the remaining quarter was evenly divided, quite interestingly, between those who thought the draft covered more than the essentials and those who thought they did not cover the essentials. Then, when asked to think about specific types of camps and camp-like settings, the results looked somewhat different for different types. And I would highlight here in particular that respondents found that they applied less to self-settled informal settlements and only somewhat more also to neighborhood approaches or defined geographical areas. So those two, while there was an overall support in all the settings, those two had a little bit less support.
Okay, so Catherine, perhaps I could ask you to reflect a bit on this question of applicability to different contexts. So noting that respondents seem to believe that the standard applied well across different kinds of contexts, but better in some than in others. What is it that's different about informal settlements, about neighborhood approaches, that respondents might find there to be less of a match with the standards, that the standards might be less applicable in those areas? Just a few reflections from you, Catherine.
Sure. I think this came out during our consultation in Somalia, since we are doing a dispersed settlement approach more than the traditional camp management. But we were able to give our feedback into that, and I think the standards are even more important in these contexts that are not as straightforward as what most camp management practitioners are used to. And we're kind of making up the strategy as we go along, depending on how the context changes. And so we need the standards more in those situations to reflect back and figure out what direction we should go in and what we need to hold ourselves accountable to ensure that we're doing good camp management, even though it's in a non-traditional style. So I think while maybe people might not see these approaches in them when they look, as long as we're applying the general standards to the context, I think that we can successfully use these in an out-of-camp or neighborhood or evacuation center approach.
Okay, great, thank you. And back to you, Marcus.
Very much. So then we had a few questions on the structure of these standards as well. So asked about the structure, it was evident that many of the respondents found room for improvement, but were overall positive. So in the chart in front of you there, you see the small peak on the far right are the people who gave it a full score on clarity, but as you can see, it was less than 20% giving it that score. The rest were quite evenly spread between 50 and 100. So a majority giving a score of 50 and above. We can at least see that the few people found it catastrophical, but there was still room for improvement. We also asked about the level of detail in the standards. Here, respondents were more positive, with close to 50% thinking that it was perfectly balanced between too much or too little detail. But among those who did not think it was balanced, it was clear that they, in overall, thought that there was too much detail in standards rather than too little. If you look at that chart in front of you, it's quite clearly skewed to the right.
All right. Perhaps, Sabit, if we still have you on the line, I could ask you to reflect on this briefly. So, given what we've seen, that people in general found the standards to be relatively clear, but there may be some room for improvement, and in general well-balanced in terms of the level of detail, but if anything, perhaps could have a little bit less detail. What are your views on that, Sabit, about whether you have any thoughts or you found there were any discussions in the context of the consultations you were involved in regarding the structure and how in practice they could be further improved. Over to you, Sabit. Any thoughts on this?
I think the structure of the standard is good. What is important for me is that it was able to capture what it was aiming at, and then because you could see from the people how people were trying also to respond and so on. So for me, it was very important that it captured the attention, and then to respond also to the important questions which are affecting the IDPs, and then also challenges to NGOs, and then partners on the ground. So I think it was good in general. It was good for me, and maybe during the time, because situations, of course, as many have said, in different countries, situations are different, and camp-like settings are different. Like for us here, the POCs are different. But with the time, maybe some challenges might come, which can maybe be another issue, or to be added in the standard, or to be improved with the due time. But for the moment, I think it was good to have it, to have that structure, and then to have that standard also, so that it can help people to especially the account managers, to respond to their duty. Back to you.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Sabit. And to Marcus.
So, thank you, Nerd. Then for the final set of results here. So when asked about other standards, respondents reported using a number of other standards and guidance in order that they use in order to clarify roles and responsibilities related to camp management. And here it's just worth highlighting that the Camp Management Toolkit, the Sphere Handbook, the Core Humanitarian Standard, and the UNHCR Emergency Handbook stood out. And then we asked also about whether respondents saw any overlap with these standards that they were using with the draft camp management standards, and all four of those top international references that I listed were found to be overlapping at least somewhat, and you can. It's a little bit of a complex picture, but they are all quite overlapping according to the respondents. There was considerably less overlap though seen in comparison with national standards and legal framework. But then even taking this into account, because this may or may not be seen as a problem, a strong majority, 64%, saw a need for camp management standards, with 17% not seeing a need for them, and 19% saying, I'm not sure.
Okay, great. Marcus, could we go back one slide so that we can all take another look at that other standards overlap? Perfect. Thank you. I wanted to turn to Jennifer to see if you have any reflections, again, seeing these very fresh results regarding perceived overlap with other standards and guidance. Do you have any concerns about this regarding the draft camp management standards? So what are your thoughts? Over to you, Jennifer.
Well, I find this overlap question a little bit confusing, but I would say that I would expect there to be overlap with the camp management toolkit, and that actually it was pointed out in the retreat last year for the CCCM where we talked about the standards themselves, and we had prioritized this on our work plan. And I believe it was one of my colleagues who called this a very precious task to be able to find the ways in which the camp management standards were recognized in the camp management toolkit, because the camp management toolkit itself doesn't even have an annex or an index to be able to find all the different references in it. So you have to really know the camp management toolkit. So if someone is saying that there's overlap, I think that's positive. And that's because I know the camp management toolkit quite well. So that's a really good thing in a way, that if it's already in our guidance, that it's recognized as there. I find it a little bit more confusing to see that there's some overlap, this 30% within the SPHERE handbook, because SPHERE doesn't actually mention the tasks of the camp management toolkit, but maybe that's going back to that controversial question that we were asking at the beginning. So as far as the core technical, the core humanitarian standards, actually core would support us developing technical standards. And so, I mean, I think when I went back and reread the core humanitarian standards, which are about the professionalism of humanitarian agencies, they were endorsing actually each technical sector developing standards for themselves and referring to those. So I think that there's a lot of really good and positive information in this overlap, but I would want to see more where people thought that was. And I'm not surprised to see that in national standards that there isn't very much overlap, because national standards tend to be more technical as opposed to around the practice of camp management, and more, which is more social.
Okay, great, and point very well taken regarding the toolkit, right, that there really should be overlap there between the toolkit and the draft standards. Since we've come back to SPHERE, and we did have a lot of questions coming in about SPHERE, I wanted to throw one more of those over to you, Jennifer, and that's it's regarding, I guess, the structure and the logic of the SPHERE standard, and then the kind of target structure and logic of the camp management standard. There was a question from Axel about whether there would be an effort to try to harmonize. So given that the content does not overlap so much, would there be an effort to try to harmonize the structure? I guess what he might be getting at is would the camp management standard potentially then become a companion to SPHERE in a similar structure? Has that been discussed? Over to you, Jennifer.
I think that's something that we would want to discuss at this year's retreat, because I think there's a lot of confusion around the typologies that have been included in SPHERE, and that actually a lot of the most close counterparts that we have within camp management are probably in the shelter sector. And a lot of times when the CCCM cluster gets activated, we get activated together with the shelter cluster. And so I think the close work that we would want to do is around kind of helping SPHERE to understand our typologies and the work in which we do in groups of people living together, and the work that shelter does, which is around improving a specific shelter or designing a specific shelter, as opposed to working on the social aspects. And so, I mean, I think that we would want to work closely with the shelter colleagues around having them understand typologies in relationship to the CCCM framework. And I know there's probably some ambiguity about neighborhood approaches, or yeah, neighborhood approaches, I guess, is the right terminology. So we would want to work closely with them on that. but I don't see it making any kind of difference as far as the structure or the logic, because lots of different technical sectors have different structures. If you think about what the child protection minimum standards have done, or the protection ICRC professional standards have done, they have really different frameworks, and so I don't think that there should be any need for us to justify our logic or our structure based on sphere. I think we are our own technical sector, and we have every right to define those things for ourselves.
Okay, thank you very much. So we have a bit of time left. I'm going to jump back in our agenda because I don't want to miss talking about how we envision these standards actually being used in practice. So I'd like to go back to you, Gebre. So you've been a part of DRC's impact team, and in that role, you've been involved in setting up CCCM programs. How would you envisage using these standards once they're finalized? How would they actually affect your work day to day? Over to you, Gebre.
Well, day to day, I mean, one of the biggest challenges we face in establishing a humanitarian our operations in a humanitarian context is that there is a lot of disagreement about what the objectives of any particular sector or what the day-to-day objectives should be. And it's more complicated when it's something like camp management, which is very much not a service that is like wash or shelter, where you provide a certain set of goods, or the way you provide those goods is a primary role. Our goods are a lot more non-tangible, and providing these services are very essential. We don't have a professional team behind us to back that up. So one of the things we're hoping, or at least I'm hoping, and my colleagues are hoping we will achieve with the CCM standards or the camp management standards, is that we'll have more principled humanitarian action. And this will contribute to holding us to account, as I said before, and that we, as a sector, we will have at least a basic set of objectives and targets for our activities that we can agree on before the emergency starts. So that at least on the ground, we won't disagree about the need for these activities, nor the way it should be implemented, or what we should achieve with these activities. So that's one of the major reasons we're working so hard with Jennifer and the rest of the team to bring it to fruition.
That's really excellent. Thank you so much. Catherine, a similar question over to you. I understand that the standards, although they're only in draft form so far, have already been piloted in some areas where you've been working. Can you tell us about how you've been using the standards in Somalia, I believe? Is that right?
Yes. So we started using them last year during the HRP process, the Humanitarian Response Plan, because we had a lot of new partners on board who knew what was needed in camp management and had been trained and had been working in camps for a long time, but they had never done any kind of proposal development or setting up of like camp management systems in their camps. So we rolled them out last year in order for them to help them write their HRP project pages, which is a bit boring, but it really did help put some direction on exactly what we should be doing in each camp. How I want to be using them more in Somalia is we're doing a lot of remote management, and so we need these standards for accountability to ourselves as camp management practitioners and to the population. We always think like camp management is hard to explain to people who don't do it, and some people think it might not be tangible, but you don't know you need camp management until you finally have it and you see the big improvement that it can actually give to a camp. And so without camp management, things in the camp are a mess. And when you do finally get these standards in place in a camp, you can really see the improvement not only in living conditions, in efficiency of money for donors, in the population, like their ability to participate. And so I hope that in the next, once we have these standards, we can use them to make ourselves better camp managers in the country.
Great, thanks a lot, Catherine. So we have reached the end of our time now for today. I'd like to do a quick round the virtual room to get brief closing thoughts from all of our panelists. I'll start with you, Sabbat. It's been great to have you on the line. Do you have anything you'd like to share with us now before we end? Over to you, Sabbat.
Thank you very much. Just regarding the standards, as mentioned by colleagues also, that is really very important to have it because it will help the camp managers to deliver their service with clarity and accountability. And it also unifies our work as humanitarian on the ground so that all of us will speak the same page, we speak the same language. And only that I'm sometimes a bit, maybe I'm a bit confused because there was a kind of, I remember 2 or 3 years ago, there was an issue about the objectives, indicators. For example, when you go to monitor the partners on the ground, then they'll say, okay, for us, we have our own indicators, we have our own objective regarding this project. And then CCCM said, okay, but for us also we have these indicators we are looking at and so on. So there was this kind of, I don't know how this is standard, we need to be able also maybe to solve these issues. ICCM and then the partners on the ground. I don't know whether you capture my question. Back to you.
Okay, thank you, and thanks again for being part of the discussion and the larger process. Now to you, Catherine, do you have any brief closing remarks you'd like to leave us with?
I'm happy that there's been such an interest in the camp management standards. We, I think, had 130 people on this webinar. And to go back to the controversial question of CCCM not having developed in the last few years, I think we proved that wrong on this webinar. And I look forward to working with all of the people here to formalize the standards and start using them everywhere.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for being a part of the discussion today. And now to Gebre, over to you for brief closing remarks.
Well, I'd like to thank everyone who participated. So, that if you keep participating, we'll I'm not getting.
Okay, unfortunately, I think we just lost audio from Gebre. I'm so sorry about that, but at least we had you for most of the event. Thank you so much for all of your contributions, for your hard work on this initiative, and we look forward to working with you more in the future. And then last but not least, over to you, Jennifer, for your closing thoughts.
Well, I'd like to thank all the participants and particularly PHAP for your partnership. But I just want to remind each of us that any of us could be displaced at any time and need to live in a temporary site. And what would we want to have our rights be? How would we want to be represented? How would we want the camp management agency to treat us? How would we want our own government to treat us should we become displaced? And these camp management standards are one way that we can articulate that by working together to really define what is our vision for them. So thanks to everyone who came into the call, and thanks to PHAP for getting us started in our first online consultations with people outside of our sector. So it's really been a great and very useful process.
Our pleasure, and thank you. So now we'll bring this to an end. Thanks once again to everyone. The recording of the event, both in video and in audio-only podcast format, will be available on the event page in the coming days. We'll also be posting the survey results once those are completed. And once again, if you did not have the chance to complete the survey before the webinar today, you do have a final chance. We're going to open it back up and leave it open for the rest of the day. So if you can complete it before tomorrow, we will be able to include your input in the final report. So with that, I'd like to thank everyone once again, both panelists and participants, for a very interesting discussion. There's clearly so much engagement on the issue and so much more to say. We very much hope that we will be able to continue the consultation in the online sphere in this manner to further support this important standards process. Thanks so much to my colleagues in the PHAP team preparing the event, as well as everyone at IOM, UNHCR, ACTED, NRC, DRC, and others who have all been contributing behind the scenes to the preparations. This is Anherad Lang signing off from Geneva. Thank you very much.